and I think we're live. Welcome to our webinar on connected and autonomous vehicles. This webinar is run by Women in Mobility, and Lando Links have kindly offered to host us. So thank you very much for giving us the platform to talk about this really important topic. My name is Sandra Witzel. I'm one of the co-founders of Women in Mobility. We're a small national charity working to raise the visibility of women in the transport sector, but also offering a safe space to network and grow and learn and connect with other women and make sure we create a comfortable workplace for us. So I've got an excellent panel of speakers today on the topic of connected and autonomous vehicles. So we're diving a bit deeper into this topic. We want to look behind the technology and into the economic impacts, the social impacts. What do CAVs mean for accessibility and inclusion? What do they mean in terms of safety, and really looking at use cases and how they can impact our society as a whole and how we get around or don't get around. So our speakers today are Sushmita Das, who's an associate for New Mobility at Steer. We've got Carla Jakeman, head of safety business development at TRL. We've got Rebecca Posner, who's the Director of Inclusive Research at RIDC, and I should probably disclose that I'm also the Chair of RIDC. RIDC stands for Research Institute for Disabled Consumers. And we've got Mariette James Elizabeth, who's the Lead Engineer for Autonomous Vehicle Safety at the University of Warwick. So thanks everyone for joining our webinar. We'll dive right into the discussion. We've got a few slides here and there, but mainly we want to have this as a really interactive discussion. So we had quite a few audience questions ahead of the webinar, what we're going to answer throughout as we managed to build them into the webinar flow, I guess. But if you've got other questions, please put them in the Q&A section of this webinar, and we'll have a look to see that we can answer those as well. But then also feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn and reach out with any other questions you might have that we maybe haven't been able to answer that. So let's dive right in. Let's start with Sushmita. Tell us a bit about your role, what you do at Steer, what Steer does, and then we go into the economic data on autonomous vehicles.
Sure. Thank you so much, Sandra. Good morning, everyone. I'm Sushmita Das, and I'm an associate at Steer. So I focus on looking at the impacts of new technologies on transport, looking at the feasibility and impacts of these services and how these services can be launched in a way that improves the lives of the different transport users. I work with both public sector and private sector clients, acting as a bridge between the two, helping to devise schemes and services that maximizes the benefits to the users. Automated and connected mobility is one of the areas that I work on, and increasingly this is becoming an technology innovation that has the potential to make journeys safer, more reliable, and sustainable, while also improving access to transport if deployed correctly or efficiently. I wanted to do a bit of an overview of where we are in the UK at the moment. So in terms of regulation and as well as deployment of these services. So last month, the UK government published guidelines to support commercial deployment of automated passenger services. There are other applications of automated technology, but focusing on passenger services today. And this can be deployed through a permit system. The operators are required to apply for the permit, which they need to work more closely with the permitting authorities or local authorities, and then make an application, devise a scheme that would work for the local authority area and apply for a permit to operate these services. These services initially we think are likely to be in the form of taxi and private hire services model. but there is also potential to have more like shuttle and bus-like services going forward in the short term. The operators are required to work collaboratively with the local transport authorities as well to plan the operating model. And we are seeing that there's a lot of market interest from both international as well as some local players, such as Waymo has announced to launch services as early as autumn this year. There's also some industry partnerships happening. For example, Uber has partnered with Baidu. There's Free Now, as well as there are UK-based companies like Wave who have partnered with Uber to provide these services in the UK. So at the moment where we are is the operators are working with licensing authorities to get those permits, and eventually we are likely to see these services as early as end of this year. Having said in that backdrop, we have recently published a study looking at the potential for automated ride-hailing services in the UK, and that looks at what the potential size of the market would be and what kind of transport trips these are likely to replace or facilitate, and as well as what that means in terms of the economic impacts on gross value add to GDP or jobs, and also more wider impacts such as on environmental impacts and safety impacts as well. So if we go to the next slide, I've put together just one page summary of the findings of our report. So in a most central scenario, the report explores different scenarios of acceptability or uptake of automated vehicles. One of the main assumptions in the study is that we think in the UK, given that the focus is more on shared modes of automated services, and there is unlikely to be changes in private automated vehicle ownership, at least in the medium to even like 10 to 15 years term. So we expect that these automated ride-hailing services will first penetrate into the existing taxi and ride-hailing market, and there is a potential for a certain degree of mode shift from existing private car usage as well. They're not likely to replace public transport trips or other active travel trips. And with that in mind, we think that by 2050, there's likely to be 73,000 automated ride-hailing vehicles across the UK. Just to give some context, currently there are around 300,000 taxi and private hire vehicles in the UK, and this is about comprising about 30% of the existing fleet size in the UK, accounting for about 1 to 2% of the total vehicle traffic in the UK. What that means in terms of the impacts, this might add over 5 billion to the total gross output in the UK. So this considers the impacts of exports and imports. So this is just the benefits to the UK economy, what is produced locally in the UK and sold in the UK. And in terms of gross value add, which is basically in simple terms, the profit for the economy is going to be as high as 2 billion. And in terms of wider social impacts, we've also looked at the emission savings from operations of these vehicles. So this is looking most likely these vehicles are all going to be electric vehicles, and because of the automated powertrain, they're likely to be more efficient than traditional electric vehicles as well, because they will have more better speed control and they will have better braking systems. With those factors considered, about 200 million kilograms CO2 equivalent can be saved in the UK, which is a significant amount, which I think in comparative terms, that's like electricity consumption of up to 20,000 households in the UK. And then we've also looked at the safety impacts. Initial research and evidence shows that they're likely to be much more safer automated vehicles, and therefore this can save up to 24 million per year in terms of savings, social cost savings from like hospital costs or accident costs or other insurance and administrative police cost, for example. So combining all those factors, it can add up to 24 million per year to the UK economy. Another important thing we've looked at is a number of high tech jobs that this sector could support in the UK. Up to 50,000 jobs will be supported through the operation of these, can be supported through the operation of these services in the UK. uh, and then we've looked at like different elements within that. There will be a lot of like manufacturing jobs, which is in the production of the base electric vehicle as well as the software and hardware that goes into the vehicle. And then also the major element will be the operations related jobs. About 16,000 jobs in the software industry supporting fleet monitoring, remote monitoring of the fleet uh, in the UK, as well as there are other jobs in the energy sector, as well as just general business operations sector as well. So, as in summary, uh, there are potentials, and it's likely to support high tech jobs in the UK, which should be considered while looking at regulating these services going forward.
Okay, that was wow. My head is buzzing. Lots of big numbers, and clearly there's a big economic impact and on also the labour markets, but also how I guess how our transport systems are going to develop in the future. There are a lot of really great questions from the audience coming in live. So I'm just going to pick a few. So one that goes directly to your presentation, Sushmita, is from Roger. Does your estimate of CO2 savings from autonomous ride-hailing take account of the impacts of vehicle manufacture and disposal as well?
At the moment, no. So this is just looking at the tailpipe emissions. So comparing to the potential uptake of electric vehicles in the UK in the long term versus all these vehicles being just electric. Uh,
Yeah.
so we've looked at just the tailpipe emissions and not the overall
Yeah.
life cycle of emissions.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thanks for clarifying that. And then there are a few questions about jobs as well, which I think fit quite nicely in here as well. Andrew is asking, what is the downside in terms of jobs? For example, the loss of jobs for current taxi drivers. Um, yeah, I think. Yeah, and then Philip is asking a similar question. So yeah, let's talk about jobs there. What do you think?
So one of the recommendations, so the answer is I don't know how. So this looks at the jobs, high-tech jobs that will be supported through the sector. Uh,
Yeah.
but the thing is that one of the recommendations in our study is to for the regulators to think about how to facilitate transition of
Mm.
the jobs that are replaced. So that could be in terms of like supporting a more gradual integration of automated vehicles into the fleet mix, so you don't have like 100% of the vehicles being EV in 2 years' time. It should be more gradual, and then companies can incentivize or invest in adult learning so they can develop their skills gradually going forward. And yeah, those are some of the actions that could be taken, and definitely we think that policies should consider how this will be facilitated. But
Yeah.
a lot more thinking is required. Is what I think is going to happen. Uh, and we think that the early deployment would most likely be in areas where there is potential for more demand. There is unmet demand. Say, for example, when we were undertaking the study, and some of the operators said that these vehicles can operate 24 hours, all days for all days of the week. So there's some unmet demand. We did some analysis looking at like there's demand at night, for example, when there's not enough drivers. especially not in main cities, but also in like suburbs and smaller towns, which these automated vehicles can help meet. So it's like looking at the use cases.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. We'll take two more audience questions, and then we move on to Mariette, and we'll talk more about safety. And I can see there's already a question about safety. Mariana, we come to your question because safety is a big topic in this conversation. So bear with us, please. In the meantime, Tom is asking, how low do you think the cost per kilometre to the passenger may fall to? McKinsey does not rule out £1 per kilometre. What would the impact be on public transport, walking, wheeling, and cycling? And would high uptake of AV taxis prompt road pricing? Do you have any thoughts on that one?
So at the moment, the robo taxis are up to 30% more expensive than the operations that are there in the US, up to 30% more expensive than traditional ride hailing. But there are studies that claim that when these are integrated and the technology is refined enough, there will be less investment in the technology development itself, and that can reduce the costs to uh, up to 80% lower than than the current prices. But then it's on the regulators to an extent to regulate the prices. They might charge there's already discussions on how to charge the robo taxi operators, for example, going forward, so that they don't get as cheap as public or cheaper than public transport, or encourage replacing sustainable transport trips in the future. So it depends on the regulators to an extent how the pricing is affected.
Okay, thank you. And just one more question from Howard here, which I think is burning on everyone's mind. Are AVs just going to put more vehicles on the street, or are we going to see less vehicles further down the line? What are your views on that one?
I mean, to be honest, there is no clear answer to this. It could go either ways. If I mean, deadheading is a concern, but we don't think, especially in Europe and especially in the UK, we don't think that they will come and replace all the active travel and public transport trips that we have. They're most likely going to because they're probably going to be more expensive for a very long time. uh, and uh, and it's like, the permit system, for example. There will be a quota on the number of vehicles that can be deployed. Uh, so I mean, situation where we will have a lot more traffic congestion is unlikely to happen in the medium term. Is my opinion about it. I don't know where the industry would go, where things would go, but that can be regulated and minimized.
And just to add to that, I think an ideal scenario would be self-driving technology used for shared mobility services, complementing public transport.
Yeah.
So that would be ideal, but yeah, we do not know how it's going to go, as Sushmita said.
Yeah, and to add to that, like, the regulators are currently focusing on shared mode itself. They're not talking about like all private vehicles will also be AVs, and that's not even like discussed. So that gives some certainty that there's unlikely to be a lot more personal vehicles anytime soon.
Yeah. Rebecca, you had your hand up as well.
Yeah, I think just building on that, I think there's an assumption that we're making here that AVs are just one type of technology and that they're just robo-taxis or they're just private cars. And I think that's often an assumption that that sort of governs this discussion quite a bit, which is automation is a technology that can be integrated into existing services. So we could have existing fleets of buses, for instance, that are retrofitted or newly built with automated technologies brought onto it. So I think when we look about, it's a very, very important risk to raise, but we've got to challenge the assumptions behind that. That is, automation is not just going to be the robotaxi use case. There's a wealth of other use cases out there that could be introduced that sort of directly address this problem. And I think when we look at, and I'm sure we'll touch on this a little bit more in a second, but when we look at the use cases for the user demand, they're not private vehicles. So even though that may be where the sort of conversation is predominantly focused based on where we're seeing the primary use cases and currently in the UK and internationally, that's not necessarily matching where user demand is. So it's an important risk to raise, but we mustn't forget that the robotaxis are one of many use cases of automation.
Yeah, that makes sense. And they get a lot of, we'll talk about that later, they get a lot of media coverage, which is probably why they're more sort of front and centre in people's minds. Okay, thank you. Let's move on and dive a bit more into the topic of safety. So, Maria, do you just want to introduce yourself, tell us what you do at the University of Warwick, and then share your thoughts on safety?
Thanks, Sandra. Hi everyone. I'm Maria James Elizabeth. I work as a lead engineer for WMG, the University of Warwick. So in my role, I'm focused on safety analysis of different kinds of complex systems, not just connected and automated vehicles, but also broadly diversifying into other domains like aviation and marine. I'm also involved in safety case development. And safety analysis involving the application of various safety analysis techniques. Yeah, so that's where my expertise lies. Dave, can you move on to my slides, please? Yeah. The next slide, please. So, yeah, in my presentation, I would like to focus on two key facets of safety, which are engineering safety and communicating safety. The engineering safety is about building safe self-driving technology that can operate on the roads using appropriate hazard analysis techniques where you identify hazards and eliminate or mitigate risk. Can you move on to the next slide, please? Yeah. So traditionally, accidents have been viewed as a simple chain of events where something happens, A happens, which causes B, which in turn causes C, leading to the accident. And many familiar tools like some of you might be familiar with FMEA, fault trees, event trees. They are built on this logic that you fix or strengthen one link and it prevents the accident. But if you look at complex socio-technical systems such as CAFs, they comprise of or consist of many parts, not just hardware and software, but also the human operators, the passengers, the infrastructure, other road users, local authorities, governmental bodies, and so on and so forth. Quite often, each of these parts in isolation, they work completely well as designed. But problems arise when they interact under real world conditions. And quite often, new technology is introduced without considering how it affects people, processes, existing infrastructure, etc. So, a decomposition analysis, like these traditional techniques, will not help always solve the problem, which is where systems thinking comes in. Could you move on to the next slide, please? Yeah, the next slide, please. So, what is systems thinking? So systems thinking is an approach which is used to understand and analyze complex socio-technical systems by examining how various parts interact and influence one another. So a key focus of systems thinking is on emergent properties, which are properties which emerge when the system is viewed as a whole and not when individual parts are looked at in isolation. So if you look at the figure on the right, this is something we call a control structure where we have modeled a very high level control structure showing the interactions between various components. So when you analyze complex socio-technical systems, it is important to consider not just the technical aspect, which is the ADS vehicle in this case, but also the social dimensions around it. And in my role at WMG, we apply various safety analysis techniques based on system thinking, such as STPA, to analyze how unsafe interactions between various parts in complex socio-technical systems can lead to accidents. Can you move on to the next slide, please? Yeah, so moving on to the next facet of safety, which is about communicating safety. So once you've built these safe systems, and it is you need to communicate effectively to the public about the key messages and knowledge that you've gained through research-based evidence in an effective way, which is where PAVE UK comes in. So move on to the next slide, please. So WMG, we have partnered with the Department for Transport, CCAP, Transport for West Midlands, to come up with this initiative called Pave UK, which has a vision to enable public trust and acceptance of connected and automated mobility technology through accurate and inclusive engagement and education programs. It is essentially a set of key stakeholders who actively work on identifying the set of key attributes needed to realize trust and implement appropriate measures in response. Next slide, please. The measures include knowledge tool, FAQs, surveys and focus groups, outreach activities such as being at the Cheltenham Science Festivals, ministerial roundtables, info share, expert panels, and so on. So, if any of you are interested, please reach out to us using the contact details in the footer and follow our LinkedIn page to learn more. Thank you. That's all from me.
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation. That's really interesting, the distinction between sort of physical safety and the perception of safety and how to communicate safety. Because I guess for a passenger, they sort of merge into the same thing, and then they end up, if they've got a negative perception or had a negative experience, they're then not going to be open to this transport mode. So, for example, for me, I had a negative experience just watching someone using an autonomous vehicle in China. They were actually testing it and sharing their experience as they went on the ride from the booking to getting into the vehicle and then driving through a really busy Chinese city and then getting out at the other end. And the experience was for me, so hard to watch as a disabled transport user, because there were so many points in this whole journey where I felt, well, I really wouldn't feel safe in this. And the worst was probably when the car stopped and it couldn't figure out where to stop. So it just stopped in the middle of a very busy intersection. And the passenger had to exit the car at that busy intersection and then walk across the road. Now, they were quite fast, so they got away safely. But for someone like me who's very slow and who doesn't find moving around that easy, it would have been extremely unsafe. So I've had this one experience that wasn't even mine, but I watched someone have that experience and I sort of applied it to myself. And now I've got a very sort of negative impression of this transport mode that in theory I'm really in favor of. So how do we deal with that? Carla, you had a point of view on that one.
Yeah, it's very difficult, isn't it? Because we are trying to we are innovating this whole concept in the digital age. So if you think back to when cars were invented and trains were invented, for example, and back in the 1800s, I can't remember the exact dates. But those, back in those days, we didn't have social media. We had a few cameras. And some newspapers, but we certainly didn't have people filming every little incident. And and it's very difficult because we often see some of those cases where it didn't quite go well. But I wonder, Sandra, if your perception would change if you'd seen lots of videos about how it worked really well. And I'm not negating that, these things do need an awful lot of work still, which is, what I know that we're going to talk about later on. But I do think that is a very, it's a big consideration. We're in the digital age and we are a culture of let's show where it went wrong instead of where it went right.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There might be 1,000 examples where it went right, and I've seen the one where it went wrong, but that's the one that's going to stay with me. So yeah, it's and that's where the communication part of safety comes in, I guess, and where I assume PAVE is sort of trying to steer the conversation a bit. Rebecca, you had your hand up as well.
Yeah, I think I'm sure we'll talk about this many times throughout this morning, but I think trust is the hardest thing to gain and the easiest thing to lose, and especially when it comes to things around safety and perceptions of safety. And I think too often we have focused entirely on the performative safety of, and by that I don't mean as in like inner performance, but the safety of the driving or the behavior and so on, without ever really considering or reflecting on how the user feels inside and how that varies across different users. And that could be anything from, as you say, Sandra, you experienced that from someone in the environment looking at it, but it could be that the person who was inside made the decision to stop there for various reasons, and they might feel safe in that situation, or they felt incredibly unsafe, and it was in and how that was communicated to them. I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about this in a second, but I think the ways through which, especially in the early stages of this technology, too often when we talk about cabs, we try and make it look like it's a finished product, and we try and say like it's done, it's sorted, and so on. And actually, I think that does a massive disservice to the technology in itself, because what we're trying to say is we're trying to convince everyone that it's ready, whilst actually it is still an incredibly novel technology that is still in trials. And if we look at the current language in UK policies and regulation, it is all trials. And I think that that is often seen as a bad thing, while actually when we look at user requirements and user experience, they particularly value the emphasis that is put on the trialing phase, because it demonstrates that this is not the end product, that there is a feedback loop and mechanisms that are still in place, and there are opportunities to improve this. So I think when we talk, the power of language here is really important around how we communicate what stage of development the technology is currently at, so that we're not trying to mislead or provide false expectations of the capabilities of the technologies at this stage, because in the long term that's only going to have a negative impact on the acceptability of the technology as a whole. And I think it's also really important when we use language that we try and avoid using the term acceptance, because that sort of implies that people should trust the system regardless of how it's been built, and actually moving towards acceptability, which is when we build a system that is worthy of trust. So there's no convincing required. Actually, the system has been designed to meet the requirements of the end user, and therefore that trust is far easier to gain. So again, when we talk about communication, language has a really, really important role to play in all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point. And also, Philip here makes a good point in the Q&A, saying that traditional human-driven cars are killing way too many pedestrians and cyclists on a daily basis. And if we can improve that with autonomous vehicles, then that's a big win. The question is, do we involve all the different types of user groups in the development of them? And we'll come to that a bit later. But Mariette, do you have any more thoughts or comments on the discussion so far? Do you want to add anything else? You're on mute, sorry.
Not at the moment.
Okay, so thank you. And let's talk a bit more about safety from a few different aspects. So there were two questions. One was previously submitted and one came in here. What about hacking incidents and malicious actors? How does that impact autonomous vehicles? And is there a safety risk that autonomous vehicles could be used as remote controlled weapons? So I had two questions on that, so I thought I'd bring that up. Does anyone want to come in on that one?
Yeah, I can start. So there are cyber security and software update related standards that vehicles need to comply with. So so those are standards which are being developed. There's already an initial version, but there are requirements, regulatory requirements around compliance with those standards. So that will ideally address the cybersecurity sort of issues. So they apply not just to fully automated vehicles, but even other vehicles where there is this provision where software updates can be done remotely. So so that is something that will be addressed.
Yeah, I guess it's with every technology. There's that cyber risk, isn't there? And we have to deal with it as we go along. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't use the technology. We just have to sort of stay on top of the safety requirements in that regard. And then another question that's really on my mind as well, and I've asked that in previous conferences. Moving away from the individual autonomous taxi, but to the shuttles and buses that transport more than one person. What does safety look like there for women, for example? Would I feel safe getting on an autonomous shuttle when there's no driver, there's no operator, there's just a bunch of random strangers in there, and maybe I'm in an area doesn't feel very safe, or it's the middle of the night, or what does that look like for women, for example? And obviously, as women in mobility, we're really interested in that question. And I've asked that at conferences before when there were panels on autonomous vehicles, usually all male panels, and I must add, and all I got was blank faces and just some comments on, oh, that's a regulatory issue. We don't deal with that. And that was, in fairness, that was a few years ago. So I'm kind of hoping the situation has improved, but how does this safety aspect look like? What about the personal safety? Who wants to talk on that one? Carla, do you want to start off?
Yeah, and it's very much, and there was another question that came in about how do we make people see that it is safe, and it's about that perceived safety. It's not just enough to say it's safe, and it's helping people really understand that there are mechanisms in place. Maybe not now, but there will be, or there should be mechanisms in place. So whether that's an app, for example, so someone who feels unsafe in that vehicle can, for example, discreetly divert where that vehicle drops them off, so it doesn't drop them off outside their home if they're feeling vulnerable, or takes them to a nearest police station, or alerts the remote operator without drawing attention, for example. All of those kind of mechanisms need to be put into place to make that safety feel real. But certainly we did at TRL, we did a piece of work for DFT where if you take the driver out, what are some of those roles that the driver performs other than driving the vehicle, and where can innovation replace some of those roles, whether that's dealing with some unwanted behaviour, or somebody takes poorly, or even making sure that someone's wheelchair is secure, for example. And we looked at almost 70 different scenarios and different roles that the driver does other than drive the vehicle, even telling someone where the next stop is, and where innovation can take over. And we found that there's still an awful lot of work that we need to be doing in that particular area, because there's a lot of areas where, yes, innovation can take over, or digital services can take over, but there's still that need, which will really play to the perceived safety. So there's more research that needs doing in this area for sure.
Yeah, thank you. We'll do Rebecca next, and then we'll come back to you, Carl, and then maybe you can talk a bit more about the work that you're doing with TRL there, and also about your mobility lab as well. I think that might fit quite well into this flow. So Rebecca, do you want to go next, and then we go back to Carla?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first thing is that we sort of need to acknowledge that, I think to your point, Sandra, about blank faces on a panel, I think unfortunately we've all had that reaction when we've probably asked questions to that effect. I think the main thing is we need to realise that there are differences in user requirements and perceptions of safety across the diverse users, and that the first step, therefore, is engaging with diverse users. And until we do that, and I will say this services, not just vehicles, but services are designed with, in this case, women, but more broadly, diverse users, we're never going to build the solution that actually works for everyone. And I think until we unless we stop skirting around that question, that we won't provide those solutions. We do have a growing body of evidence around what those user requirements look like. And there are very clear solutions and expectations that people have in terms of what they expect to see in those shared services from, I think, I can't remember if it was yourself, Sandra, or Carla mentioned around emergency buttons to sort of, if it's on shared services, it was Carla, whether it's increased CCTV, whether it's placement of seats and so on to make sure there's clear line of sight. So there's clear evidence that's being built. Now what we need to see those being actually actioned on by the vehicle developers and the service developers. One really strong example that I always come back to is, and demonstrating how early this needs to start, we did some work a couple of years ago looking at perceptions of safety and user requirements, and we used EEG, which is brain monitoring activity, to measure physiological responses when people were in vehicles. And what we found was if there was an abrupt stop, whether it was not necessarily as a result of a risk, but just due to traffic or whatever else, there was a stop that was performed by the vehicle. If women didn't have clear line of sight out of the vehicle to be able to get the necessary situational information to understand why the vehicle stopped, we not only saw peaks in response in sort of stress, as you would expect for physiological response, but that stress maintained at a significantly higher level throughout the rest of the journey. Men, we didn't see that response. If, however, there was clear line of sight outside the vehicle to be able to get the contextual information, that spike reduced immediately, and then we returned to sort of pre-event levels of stress and anxiety at that point. And so that kind of goes to show that it's not just about emergency buttons or CCTV, it's all the way through from how the vehicle and the service is designed. But unless we do that engagement, we're never going to know what actually needs to be implemented. And so as we're starting to see services and vehicles operate now, for many of them, actually, this is where the trial aspect becomes really important. They still have the opportunity to change that. Once it becomes widespread, if we haven't done that engagement early on, we've actually deployed services that have worsened barriers to transport for many, many people. And one of the things that's often talked about within automation is that automated vehicles could enhance the availability of services at night, for instance. Most women will not get on a shared transport without a neutral individual at night. There's no chance that they will do that. So there's another way of like reframing the services question, which is why would we not place the driver in the vehicle at night, but remove the driver during the day? So we're still getting the enhancements of that service by increased availability of the service, but we're designing it in a way that actually meets that those perceptions of safety requirements. So it's rethinking how we approach that service design.
And on the top of that, Bex, I think that there is the consideration about changing the role of the driver so that they're more of a kind of concierge type role, so that they're sitting on the shuttle to support rather than driving, so that they, and the possibilities of that are, they could help Mrs. Miggins take her shopping off and take it to her door, for example, in some of the rural areas, or there's so many other roles that particular person can do other than driving. So I think, and also touching back on something that Bex just said about making sure that we've got the buttons and all of those kind of things. I think there's another layer on top of that we need to build in right from the beginning, is that those all the notifications and signage, etc., inside the vehicles, that they're accessible. If you notice, TRL, we've recently just changed our logo and our colours, and it's because the previous branding, it wasn't as accessible as we wanted it to be. So making sure that the colours inside the vehicle and the fonts, and making sure that we are meeting the needs of those with dyslexia and hearing impairments and sight impairments, and all of those different things as well are all reflected right from the beginning. And so I think that's I just wanted to say that on top of what Bex was saying. You're on mute, Sandra.
I had a bit of background noise here. That makes total sense. And thank you for coming in with that. I think that's a good opportunity to one second, Sushmita, to introduce Carla in a bit more detail. If you want to tell us what TRL is doing, what you're doing there, and I really like the sort of co-design approach that you just mentioned. So we'll come back to that when we would dive a bit deeper into accessibility of autonomous vehicles as well.
Yeah, thanks, Sandra. So my role is I'm head of safety business development, looking across all of the different safety aspects that we do at TRL. We do safety aspects, assets and software, but we are the home of the Smart Mobility Living Lab, where we have 24 kilometres of live test track in Woolwich, where we test a lot of these innovations. And you're welcome to come down and have a look, because it's when we say live test track, it's on the roads, actually in Woolwich. If we all work there or work anywhere, we've seen all sorts. We've seen women fighting in the middle of the road on mobility scooters. We've seen youths rollerblading down the middle of the road in balaclavas. We've seen all sorts of different things. And we've also tested a lot of different automated driving vehicles and seen, we decided it was excitingly boring because it was just like sitting in the back of any old car. Yes, there was a safety driver because that's the regulation, but it's a great place to test some of these different innovations, and we do a lot of work around that behaviour, the behaviour aspects and the accessibility aspects around not just automated vehicles but other transport as well, because there's a lot of us who believe really strongly in making sure that that this is considered right at the beginning, and I'm sure that we will, Vex and I will probably be on our soapbox a little bit throughout this webinar because it's so important to us. We'll keep shouting about it until that message gets across. But that is one of the key roles that we're doing at TRL and Smart Mobility Living Lab, or SMLL, you probably hear it called.
Please do. Please keep shouting about it. And maybe we can do a Women in Mobility Day out to visit your Smart Mobility Lab. That'd be fun.
Very welcome.
So Shmita, you wanted to add something to the discussion there.
Yeah, just a quick point about like how perceptions are quite different in different parts of the world. So in the US, a study was done where women users mentioned that they feel more safe in using an automated taxi service compared to a driver-driven taxi service at night. So it depends on like what, as Rebecca and everyone said, like it's about the perceptions of safety, and it changes by users and how they perceive safety. So there's also like alternate views as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That makes total sense. And we've got a very alternate view in the audience here, which I want to share, which I think is really quite a fun idea. Philip is turning the whole situation on its head and says, I have a vision where you can check out the other passengers on the AV that you're about to share. You could rate the others, maybe even connect to them afterwards. Social interactions are becoming rare these days. Maybe sharing AVs with some sort of social media app could fight loneliness, if you can pre-check and then rate fellow passengers, a bit like Airbnb. Well, I mean, the AV could become a whole new world of dating in that regard. But that reminded me, when I lived in San Francisco, I used Uber Pool quite a bit and to get around, which worked really well in San Francisco. And you get in the car where, there might be one or two other passengers in there already, or you stop somewhere and pick someone up. And pretty much always, because you're in such a confined space, much more confined and much more personal than a shuttle or a bus, you start talking to people and you build connections, and it was just the best way to get around. I enjoyed it so much, and also I never once felt unsafe, because it was just brilliant, and there really was that connection. And I still get that as well when I use black cabs and Ubers, for example. In London, I had a 45-minute cab ride on Tuesday, for example, and the whole way the cabbie and me were just chatting away, and we had such a great time. And I would really miss those interactions, to be honest, because sometimes they really make your day, especially when you had a bad day at work, or for a lot of people that's their only interaction they have all day is to talk to the person at the checkout, or the driver at the bus stop in the bus who acknowledges that they exist. So there is that sort of social aspect to it, and Philip made a sort of slightly cheeky point, but I think there's a real truth in that. How do we deal with that when suddenly everything is autonomous and there are no people around anymore? Rebecca, you had your hand up, and then maybe we can move on to you introducing yourself properly as well, and then telling us what you do at RIDC too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that what we've just highlighted is, I think, why narrowing down the use cases of automation to one example is completely missing the point of the potential of the technology. And I think that's highlighted it really well, which is that there are so many different applications of technology and ways in which it could be used, and ways in which people use transport for different reasons. So I think it's often important to look at this as how do AVs integrate within transport systems, to fill in the gaps and enhance those, as opposed to looking for them as complete substitutes of everything. And that's especially what the public expect from the technology. One of the examples, again, around community building that comes up time and time again is the potential for AVs to reinvigorate community transport in rural areas, for instance, and how actually that could become a really replace a transport service that was entirely grounded within communities, but due to funding cuts have been lost, and whether or not there's an opportunity for them to be reinvigorated there. So I think, Philip, brilliant suggestion. Why not? Let's explore it and see what there's into that. But I think the key thing there is reflecting that when we try and narrow down automation to just one use case, we're really missing the point about the potential of this technology.
Yeah, absolutely. And okay, let's talk a bit more. We brought up the topic of accessibility and inclusion already. Let's dive into that a bit more. And I know, Rebecca, you've got a lot of expertise in that area. So maybe just tell us what RIDC does in that space and what you've done in that space, and then we can dive a bit more into accessibility and inclusion.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, I'm the Director of Inclusive Research at RIDC, the Research Institute for Disabled Consumers, and RIDC is a research charity that focuses on working with disabled people, both to understand the user requirements that they have and the barriers that they face across society, and most importantly, working directly with them to build those solutions. I also wear a second hat, which is I lead our work as part of the National Centre for Accessible Transport, which is a 7-year evidence centre looking at understanding and building the evidence to improve systemic transport barriers across our transport system. The slightly different hat I used to wear that I don't wear anymore is I created and led the social and behavioural research team within the Centre for Connected and Autonomous Vehicles, so CCAV, within the Department for Transport for 4 years. And so my roles have always been about understanding user requirements and building those into the design of transport systems. So instead of starting from a sort of technology first approach where we have a technology and make sure that in the case of automated vehicles, it can drive safely from A to B without the need for human interaction, I start from a slightly different perspective, which is what are the current barriers in our transport systems and how do we build solutions to address those, and particularly looking at the case of automated vehicles. So when we talk about accessibility, I often try and think it's important to change the lens of that to look at it more from an inclusivity perspective, because accessibility, both physical and digital, is just one part of inclusivity. You could have the best designed vehicle in the world that matches everyone's user requirements, but if it's not available to certain people, if it doesn't operate in certain environments, not an inclusive system. Equally, if it's not affordable, not an inclusive system. So I think that looking at this through the lens of inclusivity, which brings in full end-to-end journey, digital and physical accessibility. So from that, I mean from the point of journey planning to the point of arrival at final destination. So that whole service, availability and affordability is often a much better way to make sure that we're actually building services that work for everyone. And most importantly, that inclusivity is perceived as a requirement from members of the public when it comes to automated vehicles. There is a really clear mandate for automated vehicles to not just replicate the barriers that currently exist, but actually be an opportunity to address some of them from the start. And through work that we've done over the years, it is very clear that the public have a really strong understanding of what they want from AVs. And unfortunately, it doesn't always match the use cases that we're currently seeing. So to some of the questions at the beginning that I saw in the chat, the priority from the public is really the integration of automated vehicles within existing public transport systems. It's not private vehicles. There is the case for the robotaxi, absolutely, especially in rural areas and in areas where there's transport deserts or at night, particularly for women's safety, over forms of like shared public transports like buses. But predominantly what we're seeing is that the demand is for shared public transport diversifying the types of vehicles that are integrated within public transport system and using automated vehicles as a way of enabling people out of the private car and onto shared transports more strongly. I'll probably leave it there for now.
Yeah, lots to unpack there, and I like the inclusion angle because it does give a much broader picture. Sushmita, you wanted to come in there.
Yeah, I just wanted to share some data in this area. So we were working with a local authority who wanted to develop a rural demand responsive on-demand type transport system. And we worked with a lot of like elderly people or the people who did not. One of the reasons why we were doing that work was to encourage low car ownership and usage, obviously. And we realized that people who do not have access to cars are in the verge of like social exclusion. They're already excluded from transport usage. And but then we were looking at the feasibility of a demand responsive on demand type transport, community transport, and the major barrier there was the driver availability. So if and also that is a main element of cost, so as well, so that takes about like 50 to 60% of the cost of operations of those vehicles. And if we can eliminate those costs and introduce on-demand services using the automated vehicles, I think there is a huge potential there. Like there could be a community-wide automated vehicle that can also like make trips, emergency trips to hospitals, etc., as well as to local services. And yeah, that there is a huge potential there to bridge that gap.
Yeah, because often DRT services are cancelled because they are too expensive to run. So so there's definitely a cost factor. Yeah, that's really interesting. And Carla, you wanted to come in there as well.
Yeah, I just want to make us think about nirvana for a minute. So and some people might have heard me talk about this analogy before, so apologies if you've heard it before. But wouldn't it be good if so think about an elderly parent maybe, and instead of being in a taxi and being taken to their medical appointment, they have somebody sat with them in the vehicle, taken to that appointment, they wait while they have their medical appointment, then they come out with them, and then maybe they take them to the shop and they sit and they talk to them in the vehicle about their look at the photographs of their grandchildren, and and have that social interaction that a lot of people are missing. And then after they've taken them to the shop, they don't just drop them off at the door, they take their shopping in, they help them put it away, they help them find their slippers, they settle them, and they make them a cup of tea. I know that's like, for a lot of people thinking, oh, I can't imagine that happening. But wouldn't it be good if we can use this as an opportunity to create a nirvana type situation like that? It's creating a different job for the driver, but one that really feeds to that social interaction and helps, especially with that issue of loneliness and very much so in the rural capacity as well.
It's very much community based than that approach, isn't it? Which is really nice. So it's less about the vehicle, but it's about how can we make this work for the community and improve the situation in that aspect. And then the vehicle is really just a tool to enable that, isn't it?
Yeah, it's providing better services. Where can it's not just about focusing on AVs and the technology. It's about getting better transport for everybody and better social situations for everybody.
Yeah, and then that's where sort of more place-based approach comes in as well, doesn't it? Because it takes you away from just looking at transport modes and their separate silos, but looking at the place, looking at the community, and then seeing how that can work. Rebecca, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think we've touched upon this a few times, but I think it's worth making the case really clearly that automated vehicles are never just a vehicle. They sit within a broader service and infrastructure. So they have to work within the infrastructure that is currently available until we can get to the point where that infrastructure has to be redesigned. It's a service, and that Carlo mentioned the 66 roles that the driver currently does within that, but those roles need to be replicated. And until those roles are replicated, it's not a viable service. And so I think it's really important to shift the conversation on automated vehicles to automated mobility and look at it within the context of that end-to-end service. And with that, we've talked about safety a few times. I think it's also really important to make sure that when we look at the inclusivity of that service, we look at it end to end, and that every aspect, that every task, whether it's an emergency task or whether it's a routine task, or like picking the bus up, paying for the service, whatever else it might be, they have to be designed to be completely accessible to everyone. So particularly I know that there's work, I think I spotted Claire Mutznick on the participants list, who's done a lot of work on emergency responses and what to do in terms of what to do in the event of an emergency happening when you are in the vehicle, and how to make sure that the processes, both in terms of the actions that are required, can be done by everyone, but the mechanism through which that is communicated to the individual are inclusive and match those user requirements. So there's all of these aspects when we start looking at AVs as an actual service versus a vehicle that we're realizing we've not really paid attention to as of now, because we've only been focusing on the technology first approach. But until those questions are answered, we're not going to have a viable service that meets any of the potential benefits, some of which, as Mita outlined at the beginning. Those only happen if there's uptake of a service. Uptake of a service only happens if the service has been designed to meet user requirements and actually be inclusive by design.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a really interesting question here from Jessica came in that fits into that. How can we make AVs more accessible for people who are not so familiar with or adept at using technologies such as smartphones? And that's a really interesting use case, isn't it? The more digital we get, what are we doing with those who are digitally excluded and or maybe not digitally literate? We're doing really interesting work. Another company I work with is called SketGo, and we're a mobility as a service platform provider. And SketGo does work in the US in community transport. And while SketGo provides the journey planning technology, the wider organization where this sits in still delivers the customer service around that, and that is customer service by phone. It's also the technology has been set up to allow it to be used by third parties. So carers, for example, can use it. That's a really important point, I think, as well, if you want to make technology more accessible to a broader audience. But there is still that human connection. You can't get rid of the human connection. I think that's really, really important. We've seen that with the work that SketGo does with Catch a Ride in the US. While the technology helps to make things more efficient, and some people are perfectly happy to just use the tech, if you get rid of the human connection and the human interaction, you lose out on user groups that would really benefit from these services. So I think making sure digital doesn't include people is really important, that technology doesn't include people. So that was a really really interesting question there, Jessica. Thank you. And I can see both the chat and the Q&A is really very active. So feel free. I see people jumping into other people's questions. So just feel free to use those features and engage there. I'm only looking at the Q&A section. So if you want me to answer a question, please make it short. And some of these are really long paragraphs, and I don't want to read all this out on screen. But feel free to pop more questions in there. There were also a few questions about studies that were mentioned during the talk. So we're going to create a content piece around this and publish it afterwards, and we'll put all the study links in there as well. So you can have a look there too and research those. I want to stay on the topic of accessibility and in particular co-design and co-development. So, and I want to share another experience of myself when I go to transport conferences, and I sometimes see these really fancy new autonomous shuttles that are being presented at conferences, and they're great pieces of engineering and design and technology, and they look fantastic and futuristic and really exciting. But then I stand in front of them as a disabled transport user and I look at the step and I'm like, well, I can't actually get in the thing. So it looks great, but it's no use to me, or it just doesn't feel safe for me to use. And then usually when I address that challenge to the operators, the first comment is, oh, but we have a ramp. And then my next answer is, but I'm not in a wheelchair. A ramp is actually no use to me. Also, then they show me the ramp, and quite often it's so steep that even a wheelchair user, I'm like, how would a wheelchair user even get up this ramp? It's impossible. And then I'm being told, well, the ramp has to sit on a raised sidewalk. Well, but then you're already reducing the use case again and making it more difficult. So there are all these challenges where I feel like, well, I haven't been considered in the design of this vehicle. Someone decided a long time ago that the batteries have to sit in the floor. And so the vehicles are really high off the ground. And then I just can't get in. And then the way the handrails are positioned as well, there's no consideration for people with dexterity issues. And then getting out of the vehicle is then even on a potentially uneven ground is then even more difficult from a very high step. So what happened there? And is anything happening to make that better? Carla, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, I think there is stuff happening, and I'm sure Bex will speak to that. There's a lot of work going on looking at some of those edge cases, and I know there was an incident in America where someone who had disability challenges was dropped off near a curb where there was a big pothole, and you know that it was very difficult for them to get out. So there's challenges like that we need to consider, but the co-design element, we need to be bringing in so many different types. And as was said earlier, I think it was Beck said earlier, we're never going to meet every single need, but we need to be trying to get as many as we possibly can by bringing people with different challenges. I mean, even mirrors in the vehicle can be challenging for people with dementia, for example, but bringing some of those different understanding rather than, well, there's a ramp for people with wheelchairs, and just having just a few, you know, let's just catch a few of the main disabilities kind of thing. It's actually quite an ignorant view, I think, that we need to consider as many different situations as possible and bring those people in from really early stage and do that co-design and what are the implications to really work with people. What would happen if we did this? How would you get out of that situation? And because that goes back to that trust issue. If we haven't considered all of those things, then we're never going to get that public trust.
Yeah, absolutely. Very good point. Rebecca, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, I could go on this one for ages, so someone's going to need to stop me, probably. But I think that, so to put in a bit of context, because I think that often when we talk about disabled people think it's a minority. Currently, so there's 16.8 million disabled people in the UK. That's about 24% of the population. That's probably an underestimation, to be clear. Disabled people also make on average 29% fewer journeys than non-disabled people. So this is a huge proportion of society who are currently entirely or significantly excluded from being able not just to undertake journeys, but everything that you do a journey to get to. And just in cases anyone thinking of this from more of a commercial sense, that's 16.8 million potential users that could be users of a service if it's designed well. And that is repeat custom. If you look at things around retail, we can take a lot of examples in there, which is that the brand loyalty and the service loyalty of disabled people is significantly stronger than that of non-disabled people, because inclusive experiences are so hard to come by that once you find it, you stick with it. Now, I just point that because sometimes I think people just think we're talking about a handful of thousands of people across the UK, when actually that is not at all the case. In terms of what's being done, I think we are seeing an increased awareness of the importance of co-design, of bringing in diverse users within early stages of projects increasingly. We still have a very, very long way to go. And I think particularly the point is around diversity of experience, because I think your example with the ramp, Sandra, is perfect. And I'm sure many people have had the same thing, being like, we've got a ramp. And I think there is an assumption that ramps are an outstanding tool. They're not the tool for everyone. And I think most importantly, there is a broader question there, which is, well, actually, is the ramp automated? If the ramp is not automated and there's a removal of the driver, then even if there is that solution built in, how is it being deployed? Has that been clearly outlined in the stages for sort of use? Is it positioned in a way where you can actually press the button to trigger the ramp, for instance? All of those different things there. So just the sort of ramp argument is incredibly undermining the complexity of the actual challenge, which is if that question had been posed right from the beginning with a diverse group of users, that could have been built right from the start. So I think there's a point around co-design, but also co-design with a diverse representation of users. And if we look at the disabled persons community, recognizing that that is not a homogenous group of people. And so what a wheelchair user will need is going to be entirely different from what a person with visual impairment may require, or someone who is neurodivergent, and the list goes on. So there is increasing work that is going on that I've seen around visual impairment, particularly ensuring alternative formats of communication that don't rely on visual processing. But I will still argue that most vehicles that we've seen tend to have a touchscreen with no other form of feedback within them. So there's an interesting sort of dichotomy within that. I'm being positive that we are seeing a shift in terms of, and I think that the requirement for accessibility considerations within the automated passenger services licensing is a step in the right direction. But there's a lot more that needs to be done to trickle through an industry for that to actually become tangible change.
Just to add to that, I might come across as someone who's incredibly optimistic about this, but I've had these discussions with the some of the operators who are working in this space, and what they say is that AI is easier to train than humans. So going forward, we might see a service where, you know, if you have any special needs, while you book a ride, you might be able to tell what your needs are, and the vehicle can work to provide you the services that will help you to that will meet your requirements. Say, for example, you know, you can fit we already fit cameras we've seen cameras in the automated vehicles, but there might also be something that can speak to the user. So I believe like some operators are working with like visually impaired people, for example, how to make these more friendly for usable for those for them, and increasingly what might happen is, you know, you might be able to book your rides mentioning what your requirements are, and the vehicles can be trained, or the technology can be trained to address those requirements. And that's the way how I see it would operate in the future.
Yeah, and then you could potentially have a whole accessible journey mapped out, not just from A to B, but from A inside B, because you know the all the technology we have with artificial intelligence and all the memory that it offers as well can really map out your journeys in a way that's a lot more interactive, takes into account your specific situation and requirements, and make sure you get to a place in the end that is also fits your requirements. Like for example, if you need step-free access, you know, that's all something that can be checked beforehand or during the journey. So there's a lot of potential in the technology as well to make things more accessible, I guess, as well. But you know, only as long as we consider it right from the start. So a really interesting point. Carla, you had some thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to know a bit more about that, Sushmita, because I'd love to know whether, therefore, someone with neurodiversity can say in the app, I have neurodiversity, or I have autism, because so many people with autism, ASD, have a whole spectrum, as it's called, the spectrum, a whole range of different needs. So if they say, well, I have autism, will it assume that you have autism in this bit of the spectrum, not that bit of the spectrum, for example? How do we cater for all of those different needs? I'd love to know whether the operators that you've had those discussions with have really considered some of those finite details, rather than just somebody has dyslexia, or somebody has dyspraxia, or somebody is in a wheelchair, or, you know, it's breaking it down again into those finer levels, because as a parent of a child with neurodiversity, every day is different.
Yeah, as we know, like this is at very early stages of development, isn't it, Karna? So, I mean, all these things can be worked out, and the message that I got is more like, the operators are willing to work with the community to develop these services for them, making them more tailored, more personal, and give them that experience that we are talking about. It's not improve the rider experience. And the only way to do that is like providing constant feedback to the operators, how they can improve their services, what your needs are, what are the challenges that you're facing with the current services. For example, like if you're a wheelchair user, you can specify like, I want to be dropped off in a location which has these 5 different things available, and therefore the AI can be trained to make sure that those requirements are met. And then there will be like sensors, and they can all the roads are mapped, right? So they would know exactly what is the right location to drop them off, for example, better than the drivers who need to drive around to find that optimal space. So that's the advantage of AI, is what I think might be, and we need to make sure that we use it to meet our needs.
Yeah, absolutely. Rebecca, what do you want to add?
Yeah, I think Carla raises a really, really good point there, which is that the users have to be part of developing that system. And I mean that by both in terms of how the question is asked and how the offers are presented. And there's a lot of work that's going on across the broader transport sector around how, especially in rail, that's where we see it a lot, around how rail passengers can better communicate user requirements, and the way in which, and airlines as well are doing some work in that space to look at how that communication can be better, and whether effectively you can create a sort of a customer profile effectively that embeds your user requirements. And that, I think if that can be developed right, opens up a wealth of opportunities for everyone, because you can then include criteria for at night, I don't want to be dropped in these, or so on and so forth. I think the key aspect here is making sure that, and we're not going to go into a huge discussion around AI and biases, but I think that we need to make sure that the AI is trained on diverse data sets, and therefore that the solutions that are being presented are reflective of user requirements. And I think that's one of the things that, I mean, AI, brilliant tool, but I think we are very aware of the limitations within that from an accessibility perspective. So how the system is trained to find those areas or solutions has to also be built with a really strong understanding of actually the diversity of user requirements, and that's to be user-led. Because exactly as you said, Carla, what works for one individual who has, if we just use a category neurodivergent, what works for one individual who may be autistic will be very different for someone who has ADHD. And equally within autism, the spectrum is vast and diverse, and the user requirements are significantly different. So we need to make sure that we're not trying to overly group individuals into boxes, and actually recognize that user requirements vary far more. There's a lot more similarities potentially between different user requirements than being put into an impairment category may suggest.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I think we need to be aware of that. Oh, Mariette, sorry, you wanted to come in.
No, I just wanted to add that I think if there is no driver within the car, we are still looking at options where you have a remote assistant or a remote monitor who can provide the required assistance to someone who's in need within the car. So it could be that it could be the vehicle itself which needs assistance. Say, for example, it has issues in related to perception or navigating a tricky situation, or it could be a passenger within the vehicle who needs assistance, or it could be an emergency responder. So we are looking at the requirements related to remote assistance and remote monitoring assistance for dealing with such tricky situations in those cases where there is no driver within the vehicle.
Yeah, that's a really important point, isn't it? And that again brings up human connection, where there's still someone there at the other end who can step in if a use case arises that requires support, and that also then builds a lot of trust, doesn't it, for the end user to have that knowledge about this sort of safety aspect.
Having said that, there are also discussions about having AI agents instead of humans to do the job. So that's something for the future.
Yeah, we'll see about that. If they're as good as chatbots, then I'm not very helpful. But okay, we've only got 10 minutes left. So to all our fantastic people in the audience, we've got loads more questions that we haven't been able to answer. So I've copied them out of the Q&A function, and we'll try and answer them in the content piece that we're going to create. Maybe we have to create more content pieces coming out of this, because there's a really broad range of questions. Some really interesting ones we haven't really been able to address about liability and a bit more diving into policy and regulation. So there's loads more to talk about. But we'll just do a quick fire round for our panelists. If they each can share their one thing they want the audience to take with them from this webinar and on the topic of connected and automated vehicles. We'll go in reverse order. We'll start with Rebecca, please.
Oh, okay. I think my main thing is don't underestimate the complexity of building public trust. And that the only way that we're really going to be able to do that is through comprehensive programs of engagement with diverse users that take a place-based approach. I think that for me, if everyone could leave with that in mind, I think we would end up with solutions that would be far more suited to public acceptability over public acceptance.
100%. Thank you. Carla, what about you?
I would say similar actually. Let's not measure automated vehicles based on the technology. Let's measure the success on whether people feel safer and less isolated and have better communication, feel better connected, and let's measure it in that kind of way. Whilst in a bit of a call to action, really. Again, my soapbox, but putting people and the public value and accessibility, inclusivity, really at the heart of it from the beginning.
Very good point. Thank you. Mariette?
In my point of view, in order to ensure safe use of self-driving technology and to build trust, it is important to communicate not just the capabilities, but also the limitations of self-driving technology to the users and the general public.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sushmita, what are your thoughts?
My thoughts are also on the similar lines, in the sense that we have been discussing accessibility and inclusivity of the services. All I would say is the people should try to understand what this technology can do and cannot do. Try them, and the best way to deal with that is try them, provide feedback to the operators, and help them develop services that will help meet their requirements over time.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. And my thoughts are, please don't assume you know what accessibility and inclusion look like when you develop any kind of transport and technology services. If the people are not in the room, it's going to be very hard to deliver for them. So make sure you get them in the room as early as possible. That is my pledge to the audience. So thanks very much. Do connect with us on LinkedIn, and we'll publish the recording, and we put out some at least one content piece addressing all the questions. So thanks very much to our fantastic panelists and to Landor Links. And I hope to see you at the next webinar that we do at Women in Mobility. So thank you.